Good morning, everyone. If you could begin taking your seat, we'll begin momentarily. Thank you all for being timely. Good morning. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you heard me for both of those 3 claps, then you will be seated. Thank you very much. Good morning, Sacramento City College. Go Panthers! Let's try that one more time. Go Panthers! Good morning. I am Dr. Norman Lorenz, coordinator for the Staff Resource Center for Professional Development. As a student-centered professor in education studies, I am honored to represent us, work here, and share my career passion of educational leadership and professional development about teaching, learning, and service. Representing the Staff Resource Center, and on behalf of the President's Office and Student Equity and Success, I wish to thank all of you for being here today, along with appreciation to our equity coordinators and media services for organizing this event across all bodies of this campus, West Sacramento, and Davis. If you are new here, we want to welcome you. How many are here today for the first time? Wonderful. Welcome. For those continuing the journey, welcome back. This convocation focuses on the work of equity, signifying change. No matter where you are on campus, at a countertop or a classroom, in or outside, as the People's College, we serve all students for a better tomorrow. For one of the first times in our history, the campus is operating at a reduced schedule and inviting all employees to attend. We are live streaming, as I said, to the little theater next door, in the lecture halls upstairs, and to our outreach centers in West Sacramento and Davis. Let's give them a shout out for attending. Thank you all for being present. Today marks a movement forward, focused on equity, heart, hand, and head, specifically serving African American students. I trust that you had the opportunity to attend a myriad of workshops and listening sessions that empower us to consider shifting practices that strengthen our ever-growing hopes for increasing access, engagement, retention, course progress, persistence, and completion postgraduate and employment rates. We also recognize the cultural food trucks here yesterday. We want to thank Aramark for their flexibility to allow us this opportunity. We observed much networking and collegiality. We are excited to announce March 29 as our next block time furthering our work with internalizing equity. Mark your calendars and look forward for the development as we debrief on all that we have learned this week, and with the new objectives and the updates available in our dashboard data, we'll set out to develop further over the coming semester. Today, you will have the opportunity to hear and participate with experts about serving African American students and other underserved populations. With this in mind, please see the convocation schedule and know that you received a wristband and a Q&A card when you entered the buildings, for which, as you may see, there will be runners in the aisles and in your respective locations to assist in getting your questions to the presenter as the panelists begin. At the close of Convocation in this setting, you are cordially invited to a box lunch in the City Cafe with additional seating in the Student Center. Please take time to continue networking with your colleagues. Beginning at 1 p.m. today, your wristband will lead you to the Big Paper activity, promptly beginning at 1:30, where you will have the opportunity to work with the new Sacramento City College Equity Framework, followed by division meetings beginning at 3:40 p.m. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce President Michael Gutierrez.
Good morning. I think you heard me. Good morning and Happy New Year. Welcome to our Spring Convocation 2019. When I arrived back from the holiday, those of you that I was able to connect with asked me the question, what did you do in your holidays? And so my general response has been that I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with my family in San Antonio, and my mom, some of you know, has been going through and battling dementia, so having the opportunity to cook her meals and sit down with her and talk with her was very meaningful to me and very therapeutic as well. I also had the opportunity to be with my siblings, laugh, and just be joyful, and it really reinforced the meaning of family for me and feeling whole and being one. And I bring that up because as we look around here today, we are whole. We are one. As Norman mentioned earlier, we made the commitment today, this day for heart, that we would be together as one. The areas in student services and the business services area that normally would be working right now have the opportunity to be with us together. And it's not because our students are not important, it's because they are that important for all of us to hear the same message. You know, it's funny to see Norman up there, and he's like a millennial with his phone reading his notes, and I'm up here with a piece of paper, right, going old school. I'd like to introduce a couple of people here today, and I want to start off with our Chancellor, Dr. Brian King. Brian? And a special shout out for Brian because a few months ago when we were having the conversation of what we would like to do for Convocation at Sac City College, having a day for heart, he was very supportive, and he thought about the opportunity of being part of the initiative as well and being part of our college for the day. So rather than doing his dog and pony show going from college to college, he is spending the day with us. So Brian, thank you so much for your support. I would also like to recognize Board of Trustee Pamela Haynes. And Pamela probably likes more than Brian going from college to see each of the convocations because she really supports our district wholeheartedly. But I know there's a special place in your heart for Sac City College. Don't deny it. I also would like to thank, for the organization of today and yesterday as well, the professional development team, and a special shout out for Tyler Wyckoff. I would also like to thank the Office of Equity and our equity coordinators, and of course our AV staff back there. Let's give them a big hand. Last semester was pretty eventful at our college, wasn't it? Lots of things happening, from implementing AB 705, working on guided pathways, really going full-blown in our equity framework building. We had a student protest at our college, and it really caused us to reflect at our college. And one thing that I want to be clear about, though, is that many of you may think that the kickoff really caused this event. And while it did help us galvanize what we were doing with building our equity framework and looking at things with an equity lens, we were already looking at doing something different for Convocation. We were already knowing that today was going to be about the focus on equity. We may not have known exactly what was going to happen, but that was already taking place. So with that said, I want to welcome our special guest, Dr. Luke Wood. If you've had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Wood, you'll recognize that despite his many accolades and his accomplishments, he remains very humble, and he's very genuine, and what you see is what you get. Dr. Wood is currently the Associate Vice President for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion and a Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. In addition to his role at San Diego State, Dr. Wood also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. Dr. Wood's research examines factors such as social, psychological, academic, environmental, institutional contributors, and how they impact positive outcomes. His research has been featured by the White House Initiatives on Educational Excellence for African Americans, the New York Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, to name a few. Dr. Wood received his PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with an emphasis in higher education and a master's degree in Curriculum and Instruction with an emphasis in early childhood education from Arizona State. He also holds a master's degree in higher education leadership with a concentration in student affairs and a bachelor's degree in Black history and politics from Sac State. Now, if he looks a little familiar to you, it's because when he was cutting his teeth before he was Dr. Wood, he was working here at Sacramento City College in the outreach area. So let's welcome back Luke Wood.
Thank you. Good.
Welcome back.
All right. See you back. How's everyone doing this morning? All right. It's really a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to engage you. I wanted first start by thanking the Chancellor for being here, Chancellor King, who I heard is called sometimes affectionately the King Bee, and to President Gutierrez for the invitation along with the Equity Committee. I really just appreciate the opportunity to return home and be able to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing focused on underserved students in community colleges with a particular focus on men of color. Lastly, I'd also like to thank Khalid White, who's here, who has been a co-author on a book that we did together called Teaching Men of Color in the Community College, which some of you may have seen before. I know that my colleague Frank Harris was also here yesterday. How many people here attended Frank's session? Okay, fantastic. So for those of you who attended this session, I'm going to ask you to help me through one of the parts in this because we wanted to reinforce one key piece from his talk. So with that, I want to just start out with an important question for all of us to consider. And this question isn't from me, but it came from a president I had a chance to visit her college a few days ago in Chicago, president of College of Lake County, Lori Suddick. And she said, in preparing, I guess, for her college to think about some of the remarks that I would give, she said, are we prepared to be as uncomfortable as we expect our students to be every single day? And I think it's a good question for us to consider when we're talking about issues of equity because these aren't necessarily the most comfortable topics to talk about. And there's a lot of emotion that can sometimes arise when we address issues of equity because it forces us to sometimes really think deeply about what are our commitments to students, the degree to which we prioritize their success over our personal needs and interests, the degree to which we're engaging in collective sense-making and thinking about the kind of dispositions that we're bringing to the work that we do, those aren't easy conversations. But they're important conversations if we really want to advance student success. So the title of this talk is Lifting All Boats Towards Equity for Underserved Students, and that's a theme that I'll be coming back to in terms of the common phrase that you'll hear used in many community colleges, which is that a rising tide lifts all boats. In fact, how many people here have heard that statement before? I'm going to push back on that statement throughout this talk because I do not believe that a rising tide necessarily lifts all boats. And in fact, you're going to see some information that helps to demonstrate that point in line with the patterns that we see across most institutions. So, very briefly, I'm from San Diego State University, and I am the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab with Frank Harris, who was here yesterday. And we're a research and practice center. We partner with community colleges across the country to do work focused on underserved students of color, primarily, and originally at least focused on men of color, though our work has expanded considerably since then. And we do a lot of work now, in particular on food and housing and security. We also have what's called our Black Minds Project, which we had a course that some of you participated in called Black Minds Matter. And that was another initiative of our center, which is not necessarily focused specifically on community colleges, but really looking at P20 issues focused on this population. So just a little bit about Black Minds Matter, because I think it's important for us to kind of center that as part of this conversation, though this is a talk not necessarily about black students and black men, but really about underserved students in general. However, I think there's some framing that helps us to think about how we're serving all of our students from that work. So we had a course called Black Minds Matter, where we brought together scholars and activists who are focused on issues facing black boys and men in education to talk about how we oftentimes police and school black minds and black lives in very similar ways. And in fact, we think that those two are very connected. We think that black lives and black minds are intertwined, because if you don't value someone's life, then you certainly cannot value their mind. We had a report that came out that some of you might have seen called Get Out. It was a first in our series that was looking at issues of suspension across the state of California. And that's a topic that I'll come back to, because I have one data slide in here from that report that I think helps to frame some of the common ways in which our black boys and young men are framed in education, and those are patterns that we believe continue. So we have a few different ways in which we collect data from students. The first you'll see is we do a lot of surveys, surveys with students, surveys of faculty, surveys of staff. And what they're really designed to do is inform the work that we do so we can make better and more informed decisions about how we engage equity issues. So it's one thing to know we have gaps between groups. Every campus has gaps somewhere with some groups. But it's another thing to know why those gaps are occurring. And we believe that, unfortunately, many of the common ways in which we try to engage in understanding of those gaps don't necessarily translate into a good understanding of what actually to do. So I'll give you one quick example of what that looks like in terms of how we approach this work very different from others. Many of you know that there are a lot of surveys that measure engagement. There are national surveys, there are homegrown surveys, there are state surveys. A lot of surveys look at engagement. And one of the things that they'll ask is questions such as, how often do you ask questions in class? How often do you respond to questions in class? How often do you participate in group discussions? And then campuses will take that data. They'll see that some students tend to be more engaged and some students tend to be less engaged. And then there's a question about, okay, so why are the students more or less engaged? And it immediately starts with from the standpoint of assuming that the locus of that issue begins and ends with the student. We back up and we ask a question which is very different. Whether or not they ever felt welcome to engage. So whether they felt like their engagement was welcomed, invited, and desired. And what we oftentimes will find is that campuses will be looking so much at what is that outcome, that intermediate outcome of engagement, that they never stop to take a step back and think about what is their role in either fostering an environment where students feel welcome to be able to do so. We also do a lot of focus groups and interviews with students. And so some of the things that you'll see here are a few quotes that emanated from that. We've done a lot of work across the state of California, but also outside of our state as well. Every time we go somewhere else, they envy all the numerous initiatives and efforts that we have here in the state. And every time we go somewhere in the state, they're like, we have so many things going on, how are we going to control it all? So it's interesting that we are the prize of the country in terms of the work that's being done. So I think it's important for us to recognize that everyone is watching, and that's important. We have a consortium that we operate called the National Consortium on College Men of Color. It's a professional development consortium. How many folks here have either participated in one of our webinars or come to our institute that we do? Okay, a few folks in here. So the best part of the consortium is it's free. You can't get better than that. So it's a professional development consortium. We host regular webinars. We have webinars that are on our website, so if you wanted to go and check some of them out, you can. This is a list of institutions in the state. You'll notice that your campus is not represented in a free consortium, so we would invite you to participate if you'd like to. So, getting to more of the meat. As I mentioned, we did a report called Get Out, which was focused on suspensions of black boys across the state. And we titled the report Get Out for two primary reasons. The first reason is when we think about how in K-12 education a child is basically excluded from a classroom, it's oftentimes done in a very denigrating way. And one of the things that happens when that occurs is that someone will say, a teacher will say to a child, get out of here, go to the office, get out of my sight. But it's done in a very visceral way that really exemplifies how we oftentimes will denigrate certain communities. But the other reason we call the report Get Out is because of the movie Get Out by Jordan Peele. And if you've seen the movie, you may recognize the phrase, the sunken place, right? And in the movie, and I can't explain the whole movie right now and what the sunken place is, you got to go see it on your own. But basically, they're trying to take over his body, and he's being basically unable to move. And so when he's in this place, it's called the sunken place, he's basically seen through a portal of light out into the world. But around him, he's enveloped in darkness. He's unable to really move around or change his condition, and he has this sense of powerlessness. And when they did an interview with the director of that movie, Jordan Peele, one of the things that Jordan Peele said is that the sunken place represents systemic oppression, where sometimes we know that things are occurring to us and to our communities, but we don't feel like we have the power to overcome it. And no matter how hard we try to fight, we feel a sense of powerlessness associated with that. And when we're talking about young boys who are being suspended from school, there is certainly a sense of powerlessness that comes with that. And one of the things that we found in the report is we looked across the state of California is that there are a number of counties that have high suspension rates, and there are a number of counties that also have high total suspensions. And we did find that Sacramento County was among those with the highest total suspensions, but it also had the dubious honor of having some of the highest suspension districts in the state. Now, we oftentimes try to be number one in important things, but this is one of those areas that we probably didn't want to be number one in. And so one of the things that I'll point out your attention to is that there are some districts in this community, Sac City, Elk Grove, Twin Rivers, right, that are having high suspensions of young black boys. And what was interesting in the report, I think two primary things came out that when we did our follow-up report called the Capital of Suspensions. And the first thing that came out that we thought was interesting is that the biggest disparity issue, when we think about differences in how black boys are suspended in comparison to their peers, the biggest disparity issue wasn't in high school, it wasn't in middle school, it wasn't in latter elementary, it was in early childhood education, where they were 9.9 times more likely to be suspended in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. It was one of the highest ratios that we saw across the state. The other thing that we found that we thought was pretty interesting is that Sacramento City Unified had more total suspensions than Los Angeles Unified, which is a pretty important distinction given that Los Angeles Unified has 7 times more black male students. So thinking about these as patterns that are endemic to this community, and I say this as someone from this community and someone whose family lives here. I call this my home community. So I'm not coming from the outside and saying, look at how bad you all are doing. I'm saying, look at how bad we're doing. And of course, these aren't patterns that end as soon as students are in high school. when they transition into workforce and then sometimes either directly into community college or take a break and then come back. These are patterns that occur even on every community college campus that we go to. The other thing that we found in a report that hasn't come out yet, but I thought I'd share some of the data with you, is that there is also a high degree of overplacement in special education. And in fact, one of the things that we found is that there are, across almost every district, there is such a high overplacement rate that there's really a need to do some very concerted work. And one of the things that we know is this, is that when people talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, how many people here heard the phrase school-to-prison pipeline? Everybody, it seems. That the two primary pillars of the school-to-prison pipeline are suspensions and overplacement in special education. And it's almost marvelous in some way, and I don't say this in necessarily marvelous in a positive sense, but marvelous in a concerning sense, how you can have two children in the same classroom, same environment, same teacher, and they can have wildly different experiences. And I start out with K-12 because the same patterns don't just stop there, but they occur at every institution across our state, and this is one of them. That is not a dubious honor. That is a fact that affects everyone. So we oftentimes will talk about equity and the importance of thinking about equity. And I know that you've been having a lot of sessions yesterday that talked about different elements of equity, but when we think about equity, it refers to a heightened focus on groups experiencing disproportionate impact. So we have a line you can see there, and we have certain students who fall below the line, certain students are above the line, and what we're trying to do is to identify those students who are below the line and bring them up. And oftentimes the sense-making around this is, well, let's identify some best practices that we can implement across our institution that will benefit all our students, and then see how that benefits and it starts to erase some of these equity gaps. And that's a different perspective than saying, let's identify what's going on with certain student groups, and then let's intervene with those specific groups. And I'm sure many of you have seen the depiction of equity versus equality, where children standing on boxes at a baseball game, and then some children not standing on boxes, and basically differential sized boxes that provide equal access is viewed as equity versus giving everyone the same box no matter how tall or short they are is basically viewed as equality, and thinking about the importance of being equitable. And so with that, a lot of times you'll hear the phrase, thinking about this from the standpoint of let's give everyone the same thing, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I have here just a comic that was done that says, they say a rising tide lifts all boats, and the other person says, do they say when? As you can see, that's two skeletons. But we say that with good intentions. And so what I oftentimes will do in my work is separate intent from impact, because oftentimes we have good intentions and we want to do the right thing and we're trying to do the right things, but the impact is oftentimes different, and it's oftentimes based upon assumptions that we have and implicit attitudes that we haven't really come to grips with. So why does a rising tide not lift all boats? Well, the metaphor itself assumes that all boats are, for example, in the water. That every student is touched by the fabric of our institution, our programs, our services, our faculty, and that's just not true, because some students feel very isolated. Some boats that are in the water have holes in them while others don't, because of systemic oppression, because of racism, because of stereotypes, that those boats are treated very differently. And unfortunately, some boats are even on fire because of issues of food insecurity and housing insecurity and transportation concerns and employment barriers that serve as impediments to them being able to be successful in the water. And so this notion that if we give everyone access to that water, that their boats are going to rise, isn't necessarily true. And again, we have to separate intent from impact. So when we say things like that, it's not that we are being malicious or bad. In fact, we're usually saying it from the standpoint of we're trying to help and support our students. But we also have to recognize that sense-making itself, even phrases such as a rising tide lifts all boats, can have detrimental effects on the ways that we need to be thinking about how we're going to influence student success. So here's some data from this campus. This is just some data from DataMart, and looking at overall completion rates, 6-year time frame, most recent cohort, data that I'm sure that many of you have seen many times. And In the top right-hand corner is the overall completion rate for the campus, and then that overall completion rate is disaggregated by certain groups. The groups are in red are the groups that are having outcomes that are significantly below the overall by at least a percentage point. And so you'll see some groups that will stand out, African Americans across the board. You'll see Native Americans. Now, the sample size for Native Americans is maybe smaller, but I still show it because what we don't want to do is not show the data and then ignore that as an important population that we need to be attentive to. We have our Latinx population. Typically will fall a bit below, particularly when we're looking at our men and our men of color, and then Pacific Islanders. And so we have certain groups that are from certain communities that, unfortunately, that rising tide hasn't affected them. But I'm going to show you a little bit further about what I mean by this. This is just a look at that same data from DataMart, looking at the very beginning of the data to the most recent cohort, right? And then, of course, these are over 6-year time frames, so these go to more recent time periods. So this is when they began. And you can see that there are some patterns that for some groups that will go up and then go down a bit. You see some groups that have really stayed the same and some groups that have continued to rise. And so what I wanted to do is just take a moment with this whole notion that we have that, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats, and that all these efforts that we put into place have served to change outcomes. And so I just did a simple chart looking at the very beginning of this data to the very end of this data just to prove a point about what we see across almost every institution. And here's what we see. This is data for men, looking at the beginning of that data and the end of that data. What you may notice is this, is that from the beginning of that data to the end of that data, most groups are declining, and then there's 2 groups that rose, Filipino males and white males. In reality, that's exactly what we would expect, not necessarily with Filipino males, but with white males. We would expect that the efforts that we're engaging in that are designed to promote equity would serve to benefit those who have been able to have, you know, their boats in the water with no holes, that aren't on fire, and that are being touched by everything. And we also recognize that that's the exact opposite pattern for some students. Does that mean that people at this institution are bad? No, because I worked here. I know how committed a lot of folks here are. But it also means that we have more work to do, and that work is tough, and that work is deep. This is the same data for female students. You can see some groups, typically those that might have a smaller sample size, you'll tend to see larger shifts in either direction because they're looking at a smaller sample. But again, I don't want to not present those groups and have us ignore them because they're very important as well. And when we look at female students, we see essentially across that same time period the exact opposite pattern, which is that no one has really benefited. So, a rising tide lifts all boats. I think that's a question. So, sometimes when we see this data, it's easy for us as educators to try to figure out, how do we rationalize this? How do we make sense of this? And it's very easy for us to fall into deficit thinking because as educators, most of us have been trained to have that thinking. So it's actually a function of the training that most of us have as educators, which is to look at outcomes, see outcome gaps, and to say, okay, well, what are they not doing? Is it a function of commitment? Is it a function of time? Is it a function of effort? And what some people will say is, what the heck is wrong with these students? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? And then we have to think about what is the outgrowth of this? What are the actions that we're going to see that are going to come from this? Well, we're going to have programs that are designed to fix and remediate students. And some of those programs are very important because we know that some students need different levels of support. And so programs designed to provide direct support to students are absolutely essential. But when we do that, we oftentimes, especially from this standpoint, forget to think about our role in it. And I know that that's what efforts such as equity, integrated planning, guided pathways, all these are different efforts that are really designed for us to think about what we're doing as part of this. And what we think is that a better way of making sense of this is to say, what are we doing or not doing as a college, a division, a unit, that results in our students, or in particular our students of color, not doing as well as they should? And in that light, we're not creating programs to remediate students, their families, and their communities, but really to remediate ourselves. Because many of us were never prepared as educators to serve this demographic. And here's how we know that. Many folks never went through a training program on how to teach our most underserved students. And in fact, many of us never went through a program on how to teach in general. And I say that that is not an issue of Sac City. That is not an issue of community colleges. That is a post-secondary issue. It's no different at my home institution, San Diego State. So think about the average faculty member. Let's say you're a faculty member in biology. You go and get a bachelor's degree in biology, go and work in industry for a few years, get a master's degree in biology, and then you go into the classroom. And so what do? You have to figure out how you're going to teach. And so you think about who are some of the good professors that you had. And you think about what do they do, and you try to emulate some of that, and some of it is a bit of trial and error, and maybe you have a couple colleagues that provide you with some guidance. And so what do? We teach how we were taught. And how we are taught is not how our students of color learn. And in fact, how we are taught typically is totally antithetical to the ways that our students of color learn. And so we're going to talk about what that means. But it really comes down to us looking at all of this from a different perspective. Oftentimes when I speak, I use this quote because I think it's absolutely essential for us to think about these issues from this perspective. And I really employ a systems lens in the work that I do. And this is informed by the work of W. Edward Deming and Paul Batalden. He said that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. I think the first few times that I presented this at a college, there was hands that went up in the audience and said, you're absolutely right. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So will you tell our chancellor this? Or will you tell the state office to do that? And it's like, okay, I think they missed the point. But it's really about thinking about what is our function as part of the system. Every single one of us are integral components of the system. So bringing it down to the personal level is the kind of sense-making that's important. So every system, every college, every division, every department, every classroom, every office is designed to achieve the results that it gets. And it's only when we start to bring it down to that very personal level that we recognize the role that we have as perpetuators of the system or individuals who are pushing back against the system. So if every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets and we want to see different outcomes, what do we have to change, the students or the system? The system. So, and I'm sorry this isn't showing up as well as it could be, but this is our pyramid of success. And what it is a way of thinking about what we need to do to better support our students. And oftentimes on our work, particularly looking at men of color, we do a lot of work looking on black males, Latino males, Southeast Asian males, so Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese, Native American, Pacific Islander men. So those are kind of the 5 areas that we focus most intently. And again, our work has expanded since our original start of our center. So we do work now on students of food and housing insecurity, refugee students, immigrant students, a lot of different demographics. In fact, a lot of work on even transborder students, given our position in San Diego. But what will oftentimes happen when we first started doing the work is the campus would invite us in to come and talk. And they would say, I know you're going to do this thing on teaching men of color. We think it's real good. Do you think you could give us like a 1-page sheet on how to teach them? And at first, we used to try to come up with okay, can we give them bullets on what to do? And we got away from doing that. And I'm going to tell you why. And it deals with the fact that too often when we're doing this work, we start with effective and engaging practices. We start out with what we're supposed to be doing, either in our offices or in our classrooms. But we don't start at the base of the pyramid, which is our perceptions. And you can actually arm people to do more damage than good if you haven't addressed the base of the pyramid first. And let me give you a great example of what that looks like. So I was presenting at a college that is in California. I won't say too much where. And Frank was primarily leading the session. I was in on the session. And it was a session focused on college men and masculinities and looking at how sometimes when we're talking about men, that our male students may be apprehensive sometimes to seek out help because they've been socialized to perceive help-seeking as a sign of weakness. Now, as educators, we're probably like, well, wait a second, you have to seek out help because that's absolutely essential to being successful in college. And we know that, so we're talking about some strategies for making sure that that happens. So it was a flex day, so they finished that session, and then they went to another session, and the next session that they went to was done by a different person and was focused on building relationships with students outside the classroom. And what they told them is you see a student, go engage with them, and that's what's going to change the outcomes that you see. And the truth is that out-of-class engagement does have a large and measurable effect on student success. In fact, just look at black males, an example. Those who, according to national data, who never engage with faculty members outside the classroom, in a 6-year time frame, only 22% of them will earn a certificate, a degree, or transfer. But those who do so often, 62% of them will. Right? So those are two different worlds, right? So the educator, there have been educators who went through this training session, again, Frank's session, and then on masculinity that I helped with, and then the other session on building relationships outside the classroom. And a very well-meaning faculty member, again, we got to separate intent from impact, decided that, you know what, I'm going to be the change. And you know what, as soon as I get out of here, I'm going to engage students differently, and was pumped up to really do some good work. So got out of the session and looked to see the first student who could find, who happened to be a black male. He's like, oh, there's one. So walks over to the student and says, hi, I'm so-and-so. I teach here. I hear that you guys have problems asking for help. So what I'd really like to do is to build a relationship with you. So, what sport do you play? Now, hopefully, you see what the issues might have been that compounded there. And if you didn't, please come talk to me because we can have an important conversation. So we can be armed with teaching strategies, with multicultural counseling strategies, with frontline service strategies. We can be given all that. But you know what? If we haven't done the deeper work of looking at ourselves within, then we're actually just armed to do more damage than good. And that's because we know that implicit bias is endemic to our society, but particularly in education. So implicit bias are those attitudes and dispositions that we don't necessarily think about, right, that we harbor, and we unintentionally communicate those, oftentimes via microaggressions, to our colleagues and to our students. So we have to recognize that there are actually 3 primary conditions that are most likely to produce bias. I, T, and S. I, incomplete information. T, time is constrained. And three, stress. So when we have incomplete information, our time is constrained, and we're experiencing stress, we're more likely to communicate bias totally unintentionally. Now, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress, that represents Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday of my life. And you know what? It represents probably the same thing for most of you. As educators, we're teaching multiple classes, we're going to meetings, we're rushing to and from places, and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do, what's next on our plate. And as a result, because we don't have the capacity, sometimes an ability to slow down, we're more likely to convey bias. And get this, incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress, those are some of the reasons why we see a lot of research on implicit bias in education, but it's also the reason why we see a lot of research on implicit bias in policing. So we think about many of the national names that have come into our popular understanding. Most of them dealing with policing, but some of them not. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant III, Amadou Diallo, Alfred Olongo in my home community in San Diego, and of course, Stephon Clark in my other home community here, as well as others. So when we think about that, those are conditions that are ripe in policing, they're ripe in education, and they have detrimental effects on the ways that our students are engaged and the ways that they can succeed. The second part, once we get past our understanding of our perceptions, is we get to relational strategies. Are we building relationships with students? And here's the important thing that we've learned. Relationships are a foundational precondition to effective teaching, learning, counseling, advising, or any support practice. Said differently, it doesn't matter how well you teach, doesn't matter how well you put your notes together, how carefully tailored your PowerPoints are. None of that will matter if you don't have a relationship with students, because you simply won't be as effective as you could be. And then, of course, relationships then influence the ways that we engage, right? So we have to start at the base of the pyramid. And in our work, we see that there are a lot of other factors that influence success for underserved students. If we had time, I would go through every single one of these bullets on here and talk about them in depth and talk about the research that's behind them and all the, I don't know, at this point, I know that I've published at least 80 or 90 studies at this point. Frank has done some of those together, some of them separately. Our center is responsible for almost all the research out there on men of color, save some work that's being done at UT Austin. So we've been able to fill this out and have a really good understanding of how this plays out, that essentially we have students who come with different background factors and they're facing different issues in society. And then when they come into our institution, there's 5 different areas that we look at. Non-cognitive factors, we look at their identities, we look at affective dispositions such as their confidence in their academic abilities, their perceptions of the usefulness of college. We look at academic factors, the extent to which they're engaged. We look at environmental pressures that we know many of our students are facing, such as food insecurity and housing insecurity. And then we look at all those things, but the truth is, when we measure what predicts success, the factor that matters the most is the campus ethos. And in fact, what we find is that if we take models that predict student success and we look at all those background factors that you see up there and all those environmental pressures that you see up there as well, what we find is this, is that in comparison to the campus ethos, which is their sense of belonging, the extent to which they receive validation, whether or not they feel cared about and like they matter, the campus ethos factors account for 3 to 4 times the variance that we see in background factors and environmental factors combined. Said differently, what we do has more of an effect on their success than the external things that we oftentimes attribute to breakdowns in performance. So what are some things that we've learned that we need to think about? Well, in our work, we find that our underserved students face 4 primary stereotypes, 3 of them even more saliently than others. We oftentimes think about it as distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust, where we have an assumption of criminality; disdain, where we pathologize the cultures and communities that they come from; and disregard, where we assume that some of these students may be academically inferior. And so what we oftentimes will find is that when we look at what's taking place in our community colleges, we expect to see these as patterns because every community college that we've gone to, they are patterns that we see. We'll see that some students are concerned about how they're perceived by educators and how they're perceived by other students. One of the things that we oftentimes will find that, let's say I'm a faculty member and this is my class and now my class is like, I've not ended, but we've done an exercise and everyone's excited about the exercise. I've talked over some material. And then I say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do an additional exercise, break up into groups of 3 or 4, and I'm going to get this stuff set up right now, and then we're going to come back and do some more group work. Now, I do that all the time in my class. And I never realized until we started doing interviews that what we find from students, particularly from our students of color, is that they're the last to be picked, or in many cases, they're not picked at all. And if they are picked, it's with a sense of reluctance or with eye rolls or body language that suggested that other students were concerned about working with them. The same messages that they receive from faculty. In fact, what we find in the same pattern is that a faculty member might have gone over a pretty extensive model like this in their class and then say, does anybody know the answer to this? And somebody was being really attentive, and in particular a man of color, and particularly even more so a black male, will say that I'll know the answer, but I won't say anything. And then they'll have gone through some other information up on the board, and they'll say, does anyone have any questions? They'll say, I have questions, but again, I'm not going to say anything. And then a well-meaning faculty member will say, you know what, if you need some support, come and see me during my office hours. And they'll say that I know that I need to go, but I won't go. And then as researchers, our follow-up is, why? And they say, well, they'll think I'm dumb. They'll think I'm ignorant. They'll think I'm stupid. And those aren't messages that they've heard just from us. Those are messages that began in early childhood. And in fact, there's a study called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, Eccles-K, and what it has is a really cool question on there about the extent to which kindergarten teachers believe that the children in their class are incapable of learning. Now, I don't know about you all, but I think that if anybody marks yes to that, they should automatically be excluded from being a teacher, but that's a whole other thing. But the extent to which they perceive that children are incapable of learning. And what we find from that data, that when we reference the focal child, the respondent child that they're thinking about when they're answering that question, that when it's a black male child, they're 62% more likely to say that the entire class is incapable of learning. It's pretty deep if you think about it. Assumptions of criminality, we see that all the time. Students be asked for their IDs on campus at nighttime. Students being, assumed that they might be on campus to steal something. So there's oftentimes it will be treated with this notion of assumption of criminality. This is not a black male thing. This is a student of color thing that many students of color will experience. And one of the things that we see most commonly is what we call the step back. That's where a faculty member has ended their classroom, and students are coming up to ask them questions. Maybe I got a midterm coming up, I got some assignments, students have questions. So people are coming at me from all different vantage points and all different angles, and I see a student coming at my periphery. Let's say that he's a Latino male and darker skinned, and I see just a peripheral glance at him, come just a little bit right there, as all these students are coming up. And because I've been programmed throughout my entire life to perceive this individual as a threat, my initial response is to step back. Just a little bit. So slight that probably nobody else around me notices. But he does. And then so I do what most good educators would do. I say, I'm sorry for microaggressing you. No. What we do is we do what we would normally do, which is a sense of uncomfortability, so we try to cover it up. So we step forward, we smile, we put our hands in affirming posture, and we say something nice and positive to them, which only further reinforces that that's exactly what just occurred. And that's not to say that we shouldn't engage them in that way, but it's also saying that we have to recognize that we have these micro-level interactions that are marred by our perceptions. Pathologizing culture is when we make these broad sweeping statements about certain communities. They don't care, they're lazy. The one that we hear most often in our focus groups from faculty, less so from staff, is, well, they're just here for the financial aid. They'll be gone after census. And then athletic boundedness, where we assume that some students, that their sole worth on our campus is tied to their athletic prowess, and that's all that we see when we see them. They must be an athlete. In fact, the example that I gave was a perfect example of an athletic prowess. Okay, we also see issues with help seeking. We know that some men are apprehensive to seek out help. We also know that some men will perceive school as a feminine domain, in fact, more so a white feminine domain. Guess why that happens? K-12 education. What do you think is the typical race and gender of a K-12 teacher? And in fact, the highest concentration is in preschool through 4th grade, where students are learning to associate or disassociate with school. So for all boys, regardless of race, for all boys, by the time they hit 4th, 5th, 6th grade, the boy who's studious, who's raising his hand in class and is engaging the teacher, is oftentimes the same boy who's being picked on and bullied in the schoolyard. And breadwinner orientation, where some students are so focused on providing for themselves and for their families that the challenge of delaying that gratification, because school oftentimes requires a delayed gratification, can serve as conflicting. The other thing that we've learned in terms of highlighting this is that many of our students across the state, and this is statewide data from California, from our surveys, looking at students who experience housing insecurity. And it's a pretty pervasive pattern across the board. About a third of students experience some form of housing insecurity, which can be homelessness. It could be sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet, or living in some sort of untenable living situation. And what we find is that across the board, that a lot of students experience this challenge, but it tends to be even more acute with certain groups. As you can see up there, Southeast Asian males, black males, Latinas, some other demographics as well. I mean, honestly, those rates are so high for everybody, it's kind of like everybody needs some help. Food insecurity. And I'll say this, we collect our food insecurity data totally different than any other shop in the country. In fact, I'm going to go out and make a statement that may be a bit hurtful, but it's true. And this isn't about you, but about the research that's done. The vast majority of research that's done on food and housing insecurity is, for lack of a better word, is whack. It's not good data. Why? Because it's collected using online samples. So I'm going to do a study looking at food and housing insecurities, and I'm going to send an online survey to understand that. Does anybody know why that might be a challenge? Okay, so all the methodologists in the room just said, yeah, response bias. And so what we do differently is that we collect our data in classrooms with students. So we get better samples, and we only look at acute food insecurity. We don't look at marginal levels. We look at students who literally don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And what we find is this, is that there are certain students who are more likely to experience it. You can see that across the board there's some high levels, particularly among men, and that oftentimes deals with issues of help seeking. And then some even groups that fall above that. But that food insecurity is a real issue. And so this is what we've learned from the work that we do, is that many of the students that we have will not just struggle with one type of insecurities, but it's usually the confluence of insecurity. So they'll struggle with food insecurity. And 75% of those who struggle with acute food insecurity also struggle with housing insecurity. And they're most likely to be struggling with transportation concerns, employment barriers, health issues, legal concerns. And so we oftentimes will have these like, okay, we're going to have a food pantry. And that's good, but if the food pantry doesn't have secondhand clothing, access to affordable housing options and other services, then what we're doing is we're addressing one issue, but not the myriad of issues that students are facing. And what we know is this, is that if a student experiences acute food insecurity, it's going to affect their success. So, for those of you who participated in Frank's session yesterday, he showed this chart and talked about this taxonomy. So I'm going to ask you to help me through it for those who weren't able to see it. What this is a taxonomy for thinking about how we can approach this work of equity, recognizing that there are many people who have different motivations and interests when it comes to this work. And we basically inform this by the work that we do in doing professional development, large-scale professional development, online and face-to-face with a number of different colleges. And what we would find is that when we go out to do, let's say, a brown bag discussion on microaggressions, that we'd walk in and the person who's coordinating the event would be a little unhappy. And we do a lot of training on this topic, by the way. And we'd go in and the person who was doing it would be really unhappy. And there'd be a room full of, 30 people. And I'd be like, okay, looks good to me. And they'd be dismayed. Because when they put together the session, they had Jerry from chemistry in mind. But Jerry's not going to go to a voluntary session on microaggressions. Why? Because Jerry might not care. Now, there might be some other people from Jerry's department that go, but Jerry's not going to go. Now, oftentimes Jerry's not going to make a big issue about it. He's just going to vote by his lack of presence. He's just not going to say anything, and he's not going to go. He's going to be polite by not saying anything. And so what we found is that we have to recognize that in order to reach folks with the equity work, with the guided pathways work, with the integrated planning work, with AB 705, with all, I can keep going, with all the different things that are taking place, we have to recognize that there are different people with different motivations. And we break it down into two different characteristics. First characteristic is knowing what to do, and the second characteristic is having a willingness to do it. A willingness to do it. So knowing what to do, knowledge, and willingness to do it, action. And knowledge and action are not always put together. We sometimes know about things and know how to do them, but we don't do them. For example, I know how to use the gym. But I have to say, since I took on a new job, I haven't been using it as regularly as I used to. So knowledge and action are not always married. And so for those of you who participated in this session that Frank did yesterday, in the top right-hand corner, we have the first group, the individuals who know what to do and have a willingness to do it. They know what to do, they have a willingness to do it. And what do we call that group? The choir. The choir knows the strategies and practices that are necessary for advancing success for our most underserved students across the board, and they're doing it. You have a voluntary session on microaggressions at lunchtime, they're going to be there. Evening program, they're going to be there. Weekend program, they might still show up. Why? Because they have an intrinsic commitment to the populations. Then you have people who are the allies. They might not know how to serve certain student demographics, but in general, they care about issues of equity and social justice. So they may not know about, let's say, gender microaggressions and how to advocate for our women or women of color, right? But they might do work on students with food and housing insecurity, so they're committed to equity, but what they have to do is have some knowledge about how to translate what they know to different populations, recognizing that not all that information will be directly translatable. And so with the allies and the choir, the difference between the two is that the allies just need some additional training and development. And oftentimes when you go and you do a voluntary session on something, it's the choir and the allies. But there are two different groups that fall below this. The resistors and the defiant. The resistors. We break out resistors into two different groups, but in general you can see they are characterized by not knowing what to do and not having a willingness to do it. The first group that we look at are what are called active resistors. Active resistors actively resist. Two true stories and examples of active resistors. One campus that we're going to in Northern California, that's broad enough, that we are coming to do a keynote session during Convocation on men of color. And it was an important topic. We were excited as a campus. We really wanted to work with. And the day before we got there, a faculty member on campus sent out an email and BCC'd every single faculty member, staff member, administrator on campus saying, don't go. Why would you do this? This is an example of reverse discrimination. Why are we talking about men of color? There's such a small population here. Why are we talking about men of color? Shouldn't we be talking about X group? And I have to say, it was a pretty awkward conversation the next morning. Then, another campus that we went to, and the active resistor was actually the college president at that campus. I'm not going to say where it was, except to say it was in the South somewhere, but many of the greatest institutions that we worked with have been in the South, so that's not to characterize the South, just so you know. And so what had happened is a dean had invited us in to come do a session on teaching men of color and microaggressions and some different pieces that were very important. And so we get to the campus to do this training, and the president had found out about it and didn't like the fact that it was taking place. So held a mandatory managers meeting at the same time to prevent other people from going. That's an example of some real active resistors. And I could give you other examples, but I think that's enough. You get the idea. Active resistors actively resist, but the truth is they represent a very small percentage of our population, but oftentimes they're the most vocal ones. So we think that they're representing a larger demographic than they actually are. In fact, in our data, we find that they only usually represent about 10% of a campus. Most people who are resistors are not active resistors, they're passive resistors. These are individuals that want to just stay out of the fray. They hear that there's a session that's happening on some of these different topics. They're not going to raise an issue about it. They're not going to say anything. They might talk bad about it behind the scenes, but what they're going to do, as I said before, is they're going to vote by their lack of presence. And then the last group you'll see here are those who are members of the defiant. These are individuals who know what to do. They have the knowledge. They have the information. They know how to reach our Latinx population. They know how to reach all our students of color. They know how to reach students of food and housing insecurities. They know how to reach our LGBT population. They know what to do, but they willingly choose not to do it. So I like to think about this in two different ways. Some of these individuals are people who were resistors, who went to some trainings because they had to, and they sat through the training just like this. Information going in one ear and out the other. They know what to do, and you know what? They might even take some of those concepts and apply it, but they typically apply it with students who look just like them. The other group that is members of the Defiant, and this is actually the more sadder case, but we do see this as well, are people who used to be part of the choir, and they were fighting the fight so hard for so long that they got burnt out, recalcitrant, and became part of the problem. And there is an emotional strain that can come with doing this work because, again, it's deep work, it's hard work, and we feel like you're out there in isolation on your own. It's tough. Now, for those of you who saw this yesterday, you're probably thinking, but wait a second, there was one more group, and there is. And so Frank and I, we were doing a session at a conference thing that we had put together as a partnership with the Center for Urban Education at USC. And what we had is one of our funders was in the audience and said, I think you're missing a group here. Now, as researchers, we've carefully validated this work. We have a lot of qualitative work that's went along with it, a lot of quantitative work that's went along with it. So when someone says that you're missing something, those are fighting words, right, for researcher. Like, what do you mean we're missing something? And then as soon as they said it, I was like, wow, how did we miss that? Because we're not perfect either, right? And this is the group that they said that we were missing. The oblivious. The people who think they know what they're doing and really don't. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who are oblivious. And we find that there are three primary types of those who might fall into this demographic. The first are those who have a savior complex. This is what happens when we bring deficit mindsets to equity work, where we don't think that students have innate capacities and assets, and our job is therefore to save them. So, but we're saving them not because we're saving them, but because of our own guilt or drive for acceptance and forgiveness. So think about that when you engage in this work. Oftentimes people might fancy themselves as choir, but their actions show that they're oblivious. The second group that falls into the oblivious are those who are non-reflective. They know the lingo to use. They know to say equity as opposed to equality. They know to say Latinx because it's more gender inclusive as opposed to Latino, right? They know the language. They use the language. They might even be out front on some of these things. But when you look at what they say and you look at what they do, you find that there's a pretty vast void in between. That their actions and their ideology are not the same. And oftentimes what you'll find is with individuals from this group is that they started out on an equity journey at some point and then they got off the path. And then the third group that we see are those who are grandstanders. When the work isn't about the students, their families, their communities, it's not about the institution, they're engaged in equity work because it looks good, because it might help their career, because of the public image that they might want to have around it. So their commitment to equity isn't about the students that they're serving, but about them serving themselves. And with grandstanders, it's very tough because oftentimes they'll be out front and visible images of the work, but in reality, they don't exemplify the attitudes and dispositions that we think are necessary for doing the work in the right kinds of ways. So if we have individuals who are grandstanders, one of the things that you'll often see them do is they'll do things that look big and look shiny. They'll create a program that, oh, it sounds good, and we touch every student on campus, but if you look at what they're actually doing, it's smoke and mirrors. So I encourage you to think about the initial question that I asked. Are we ready to be as uncomfortable as we make our students feel every day? And if that's the question that you're thinking about and been thinking about this whole time, then you have to ask yourself, where do you fall on this? And where do your colleagues fall? And if you find yourself in a position that you don't want to see or you're worried that you might be oblivious, it's an invitation. Because we're all educators and this is an institution of learning and we're learning just like our students are. And it's an opportunity for us to grow, develop, and improve what we're doing to better serve them and their needs. So I've had individuals who've been through extensive training with us through the work that we do, who started out self-proclaimed as resistors. And I do believe that people can change over time. And one of the best things that I've ever heard, and I've heard it several times now, is from someone who says, you know, I saw the taxonomy, and at first I wasn't really believing in this work. I got to be honest. But if I was to be honest, when I started out, I was a resistor. And I can't say I'm a member of the choir, but I'm trying to be an ally. And that's all we can ask of our colleagues. Try. Because we ask our students to try to do difficult things every day. So this is just a kind of simple framework for thinking about how do we reach these different people. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I want to get to the end where I talk about what are some things we could be doing. But we have the choir. Our goal is to empower them with strategies and practices, recognizing that they have an intrinsic commitment to serving these populations. And oftentimes if I show up to a brown bag and it's only folks who are part of the choir and the person is dismayed, I tell them that's good because you know what? What we're really doing is we're starting a movement and we're sometimes have to recognize that the people who are part of the choir just need some reassurance that they're on the right track. And they also have in their toolkit some tools that need to be sharpened so we can help them with that. For those who are part of the allies, our goal is to educate them, to provide them with additional strategies and practices at work, recognizing that their motivation may be a little different, it may not be intrinsic. Maybe it's that they're committed to social justice and equity. They don't necessarily know what it looks like to do and work with this demographic, but they're committed to these issues in general. So oftentimes what I'll say is do an event that's a brown bag. Have folks come who are there because they're part of the choir, and then as they're getting ready to leave, ask them to give you 3 or 4 names of individuals who they believe will be allies for this work, or they believe are advocates for them. And oftentimes what you'll do is in the next meeting, you'll invite those choir back, and then you'll invite those other people a little bit more hands-on in doing it, and it's like a snowball effect for the next meeting, the next meeting, and the next meeting, and before you know it, you have a large group of people who are on board. because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change culture, and culture is not easy to change. The oblivious, our goal is to enlighten them. And oftentimes what that comes is with understanding that we have to have personal conversations that convey humility. Because again, with a lot of these individuals, they see themselves as part of the work, so you can't call them out in that way. We have to do is invite them to a general conversation, and the best way to do it is to model the types of attitudes and dispositions that you want to see. That's important. With those who are the resistors, particularly the passive resistors, our job is to encourage them, and in particular, to encourage them to care. And I would say that the work of our center oftentimes specializes in targeting passive resistors because there's some really clear strategies that show them through data and voice that maybe how they're approaching the work isn't the right way. And what we found is that the combination that works best is first showing them some quantitative data, so we do a lot of work with that, then showing them some qualitative data, and then we recognize later on that there's actually need to have an additional piece. So we were presenting at one of our partner institutions. We did a session showing the quantitative data that we collected, survey results from students, things that they were saying quantitatively, and then their voices in terms of quotes from them, in terms of how they were experiencing the campus. And as part of the session, there was faculty, but then they had invited students from an Emoja program. And so there was a faculty member there who saw this data, and it was tough data to see, and it's hard sometimes, again, to go through this, uncomfortable. And they said, the faculty member, I know you did all those fancy statistics and all this, and I see that you collected data from students and quotes and things, and I'm not saying that you didn't do that accurately. I'm just saying that I just don't think it represents how our students really feel. And before I could even say anything, there was a veteran student who was part of Emoja who raised his hand and said, can I speak to that? He says that the thing that you're saying doesn't happen, that happened to me yesterday. And then he went in and gave a description of it. And then after he spoke, then another student spoke, and another student spoke, and another student spoke. And you could just feel the tenor of the room. For those who are some of the most hardened and passive resistors, you could just feel it in the room that they were starting to come to maybe this inkling that what they may have thought may be really divorced from reality. And so what we find is that is the combination that helps to reach these individuals. But often, it's not a session like this where everyone is expected to be there. It's a voluntary session. So how do you reach the passive resistors? With this framework, what we suggest is you go to the places and spaces that they're at. Convocation, thank you for the invitation. All staff days, faculty days, department meetings, faculty retreats, division meetings, committee meetings, because those are the places and spaces where people are at. They're the closest we get to mandatory, and institutions of post-secondary education that rarely have anything that closely resembles mandatory. But we also have to recognize that there's different motivations. So there's not this intrinsic commitment to serving our most underserved students or social justice in general, but more so around tangible things that they can see, feel. Compliance, funding, organizational priority, recognition, tenure, release time, promotion, award ceremonies, a simple email from the president or from a dean saying, hey, you're doing a good job. There's more tangible things that they're looking for. And what we do is think about those as carrots to get folks on board with this work. Now, I'm going to shoot through a couple quick barriers here really quick because I'm going to get to the end and just focus solely on recommendations, on what we can be doing. We see that there are some very specific barriers across most of the institutions that we work with, and there's 6 of them that we see. One is policies, such as not having professional development for classified staff or managers not releasing classified staff to be able to go and participate. And there's also part-time faculty who are not required to attend and have office hours because they're not paid for them. And some of our part-timers are some of the best faculty we have, but if we don't have office space for them, or we do have office space for them and it's located in the bungalows of campus and they're sharing that with multiple individuals and they're going to and from multiple campuses just trying to make ends meet, then we have to recognize that if they are teaching our most underserved students, which by the way part-timers typically do, they teach the basic skills, the gatekeeper courses, the courses that usually the full-time faculty don't like to teach, then we're actually setting it up so the students who are in the need of the most support are in environments with faculty members who may have the heart to do so, but structurally that prevent it from being able to do that. Attitudes and dispositions. Again, there's the conscious things that we have, and there's also the unconscious things that we have. So one of the first studies that I ever did asked students about their interactions with faculty members outside the classroom. This was looking at underserved students, and what I found was this, is that when I asked them about the extent to which they engaged with faculty members outside of the classroom, what they said was, well, I really don't. I really don't have any interactions with my faculty members outside of class. In fact, what was the most common pattern at that first institution, which we've seen replicated across many institutions at this point, is that when they would see their faculty member, the faculty member would see them, and they would put their head down, they'd pretend to get on the phone, they'd walk the other direction to avoid interacting with them. Now, we'd go and we'd show this data to faculty, and oftentimes the response from faculty would be like, that's not happening. And it's because implicit bias. Oftentimes they have incomplete information. Is that student in my class or not? My time is constrained. I'm going from one class to another. I got a committee meeting that I'm heading to. Everything is stressful. The three conditions that produce implicit bias, and they had no idea that they're doing it. And so the follow-up question that we would ask is this. Why? If you're not engaging with them, then who are you engaging with? I mean, why is this occurring? I mean, who do you engage with? So, I mean, it was this sense of almost exclamation from us, and this is what they said. You know, the person who tells me, I'm proud of you, keep your head in the books, keep going, stay strong, I'm with you in this, the person who encourages me the most and interacts with me the most is the janitor, the custodian, the food service worker, the groundskeeper. In fact, anybody from those areas in this room right now? Please stand up. You are. Oftentimes we'll have panels that will have faculty members talking about the work that they do, and counseling faculty talking about the work that they do, and staff talking about the work that they do. We should probably have a panel at some point of the custodial staff and ask them what they do. Politics and power dynamics, and oftentimes the biggest issue that we see is the division and divide between academic side of the house and the student affairs side of the house, or student services, depending upon the institution. Everyone calls it differently. Territorialism can be a big issue. They might say, why is academic affairs leading this initiative? Shouldn't it be led by student affairs, or the opposite? Every campus has some degree of this. Some have done better jobs at working through it, but territorialism ends up being a big issue. Here's what's really important is that we serve our students. And so what's really not important is that we serve our own interests. And so that requires us to engage with one another. That's not a critique of you, that's a critique of post-secondary education. Structures, the way that we structure things. For example, we might have structural practices that prevent us from being able to do so. And structures can be the way that we design our institution, the way that policies are codified. It can be a lot of different structural elements. In fact, remember, we began with structures talking about every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. And so if you want to change outcomes, what do you have to change? Oh gosh, that was bad. So if you want to change the outcomes, you have to change the, thank you, everyone's back with me. So, equity not being embedded into the strategic plan. You have a campus that has a strategic plan, and then your campus that has a equity plan. Sometimes there's an equity plan, sometimes there's a diversity plan, sometimes there's an inclusion plan, sometimes there's an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan. We got all three plans, but none of them speak to the strategic plan. And so when the one-time monies or the temporary monies, when that effort goes away, what goes away? Equity. So making sure that it's embedded. Or structural issues where the faculty members who are in the need of most structured interactions with students don't have offices to engage with them, resource constraints, a lot of different things. Institutional culture. Oftentimes what we want to do is when we get dollars and efforts that are organized around guided pathways and equity, one of the biggest things that we want to do is finally use those resources to support what we're already doing. So, we've had a mentoring program for a long time. It's never been assessed. But now that we got these dollars, now we can better support it. But we don't know that that program works. And in fact, what we oftentimes will find is that too often what we do is that we look at what's taking place at another institution, we bring it to our campus without doing any inquiry, and we try that program, and what we're doing is we're experimenting on communities of color. And the last one is data practices, having access to data that's reliable, data that's in depth. The state does a pretty good job of making that data available to us. Many campuses have great offices of institutional research, but some campuses have folks in those offices that view themselves as gatekeepers. And even in times when those individuals may not view themselves as gatekeepers, they may not even have the capacity in terms of staffing to be able to respond to the true needs, because you cannot do equity work without data. In fact, when I came into the new position I'm in as Associate Vice President for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion, the first thing I asked for in my office was the person who handles data. Because I can figure out how to handle the training, I can figure out how to handle the initiatives and all the other things we're going to do, but if I don't have data, I have no place to start. Because remember that a rising tide does not lift all boats. And so I have to target those boats that are in the most needed support. So, in conclusion, what are some things that we can be doing that are important? We've learned this from the work that we've done with institutions across the state, just some basic practices that have to be present everywhere in order for us to be able to move forward the equity agenda. The first is we have to leverage the efforts of existing initiatives. Some of them are listed on the right. Chancellor's Vision for Success, Acceleration, Guided Pathways, AB 705, New Funding Formula, Student Equity, Integrated Planning, California Promise, and you could probably list 3 or 4 other ones that aren't up there. Those efforts come not only with money, but political might. So making sure that we're using them, because here's the truth. If equity is not embedded into those initiatives, then acceleration is more deceleration. Equity sinks some boats, and guided pathways ends up becoming guided tracking. So we have to think about that. Participation in statewide and regional consortia, we have to engage in information sharing, because guess what? We don't always have all the answers. But sometimes we can learn things from different places, and then we can bring that to our campus. That's also a kind of subtle pitch for you to join the consortium. So think about it. It's free. Buy-in and a sense of urgency from the campus leadership. The most important thing that you can do is have a campus leadership structure. And when I say campus leadership, I'm not solely referring to the president, though the president is absolutely essential. I'm referring to the president, the vice presidents, particularly student services and instruction, both. Got to have both of them on board. Board members, the chancellor of the district, faculty senate, staff senate, staff union. They have to be on board with the equity efforts, because guess what? If they're not, it can be easily derailed. So it's about making sure that everyone is on board. So recognizing that, again, there's different people with different motivations. We've got the choir, the allies, the resistors, the divide, and some folks who are a little bit oblivious. Recognizing that we got to have all of them on board, and there's some capacity for all of us. Intensive ongoing professional development. Intensive ongoing professional development. A one-time session, check this out, a one-time session on implicit bias is a waste of everyone's time. A one-time session on microaggressions may just teach you how to better understand what's going on, but probably won't reduce anything that's taking place. A one-time professional development session is a waste. It takes intensive ongoing professional development, implicit bias, microaggressions, teaching practices for underserved students. In fact, when I took my new job at San Diego State, the first thing I did was I created a team of faculty members who are going into every department meeting, every division meeting, every faculty retreat, every committee meeting, and doing training on implicit bias in hiring, implicit bias in the classroom, racial microaggressions, gender microaggressions, microaggressions experienced by the LGBT community, teaching practices for underserved students, and understanding what it means to be a Hispanic serving institution. Not Hispanic enrolling, because we enroll a lot of students from the Latinx population in my institution, but actually serving them. Are we actually serving them, or are we enrolling them? An intrusive approach for engaging the resistors, that was part of what that was talked about in the taxonomy. And then the last set of recommendations are equity-minded hiring practices. If every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that we get, and we're hiring and we have the outcomes that we see, then maybe we need to think about, are we doing it in the right way? 2 big issues that we see. One is that we'll oftentimes have a campus, and this may not be the case here, right? In fact, some of these things might not apply here, but these are patterns that we see across the state, right? But oftentimes you'll have a hiring committee, and that hiring committee You'll have individuals who's coming in, let's say it's for a faculty position, and they're going to do, say, a hour-long interview. And that interview includes a 50-minute question and answer period with the committee, and then maybe a 10-minute teaching demonstration or something to that effect. And it could be a little longer, a little shorter, but that ratio. And the truth is, though, what the faculty member will be doing is teaching, primarily, right? That's what they'll be doing to our students. So it'd be better for us to have a better understanding of what they're going to be looking like in the classroom. So giving them more time for that would be important, but also having a rubric that looks at what are the strategies and practices that we know are important for underserved students. Validation, an understanding of how we validate students and motivate them, right? And understanding of appropriate disclosing of our own personal challenges, relationship building strategies, multicultural teaching strategies or culturally relevant teaching strategies, and understanding of microaggressions. There's about 14 different practices that we'd identified in our work. We should be assessing the degree to which they do that in their teaching demonstration to see, will they be doing good things or bad things to our students? But probably the biggest issue deals with the interview and the questions that we ask. And in fact, most campuses have the diversity question. And usually, and it's different in some places, and I have to say the district hiring manual here, it seems to be better than it is in a lot of other places, but this is what I see in many places is this, a question that sounds something to this effect. Can you tell me about your experiences in working with diverse student populations? Which tells you about their exposure to their diversity, not their commitment. Those are two very different things. Anyone can tell you, I went to a diverse school, or I was in this diverse training program, I was exposed to these diverse students who are in my classroom, but you know what? Being exposed to diverse students is one thing, but there's a power imbalance there. So that doesn't mean that that's changed anything about what you do. Anybody can talk about exposure. Exposure and commitment are different. Commitment is a demonstrated commitment to those populations. So it would be better for us to ask, can you give me 3 ways in which you changed your teaching and learning practice to meet the needs of diverse learners? That tells you about what they do, not their exposure. Equity-minded institutional research, you have to have good data to do this work. Collective sense-making, where we're taking that data at the department level, the college level, the unit level, every level, looking at it, thinking about it, recognizing their equity gaps, talking about those gaps. Effective use of early warning and early alert systems is also important. Early warning is when students are coming in where we triage them into different areas based upon how they respond to certain items in that matriculation process. Early alert systems is when they're already in the classroom and they're teaching for our students, or we're teaching them, they're in our classroom, and we're teaching to them, and then we see a student who may not be doing as well, and we refer them to services. But what we find in most campuses is that early alert systems aren't early alert systems. So first of all, we'll find that many campuses don't have one, or they'll say they have one, but it's only for a small population or a small set of programs. Or the biggest challenge is this. We'll have an early alert system that gives an alert at midterms, halfway through the semester. And what we say in our work is that's not an early alert system, that's an early drop system, because there's not much else the student can do at that point. It has to be in timely enough for the student to be able to respond. There has to be feedback that's provided to faculty. And the last one is an approach that addresses environmental insecurities, food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers, in a way that's comprehensive, recognizing that our students don't just face one of those challenges, they typically face multiple insecurities at a time, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're teaching for the students that we have, not the students that we think we have. So with that, I just want to conclude by reiterating that a rising tide does not lift all boats, so let's make it an effort for this semester for us to go out and lift every boat for every student by focusing on our most minoritized and disaffected students. Thank you. Okay. All right, so we're going to just take maybe one or two questions if there's any, and then we're going to transition to the next part. But if anybody has a burning question, and they don't have to be questions. It can be questions, comments, fears, trepidations, areas of disagreement. Would love to hear what you have to say. I'll also make sure to leave up my contact information in case anybody wants to reach out to me as well. Cool. All right. I'll see you. No, just kidding. Any questions, though? No? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can focus on in the classroom. One, I'll just give you a few, maybe for the classroom and a few for student services, very briefly. For the classroom, we need to be engaging in culturally relevant teaching where we're addressing the students' lives and their social, cultural, and lived experiences in the classroom. But that doesn't go far enough. Oftentimes we'll talk about teaching to students in that way, but we won't recognize, and that's why I talked about the microaggressions piece, that they've experienced distrust, disdain, and disregard on a regular basis, and so our role as educators is to do the opposite. It's not enough to basically, as I think it was Deborah said, is to, she talked about this in one of the sessions that I had with her, I believe it was her, where the difference between doing harm, doing no harm, or doing harm reduction. And if we're doing no harm by just being culturally relevant, but harm reduction is actually extolling the brilliance, dignity, and morality of those same students. Appropriate disclosing is an important strategy. One of the things that we find that students will regularly tell us is that when educators talk about their own experiences, challenges that they've experienced, personal, career, academic, that serves as a source of motivation. Now, with that, you want to do it where you're avoiding statements of equivalency. You never want to say, hey, I know as a what it's like to be that, right, and talking about the student's experience. So never making statements of equivalency, but just talking about your experience for what it is and let students take away from it what they will. The importance of that is when students see us in front of the classroom, what they see is this. They see a finished product. They see someone who may be well-dressed, articulate, may have all kinds of degrees behind their name, and what they see is what they think is a finished product. But many of us know that we had all kinds of bumps along the road to get to where we're at. So sharing some of that reduces that power differential that makes it hard for some students to be able to be successful in our classrooms. Validation is absolutely essential, validating students' effort and validating their ability. I'm a big critic of growth mindset. I think the growth mindset oftentimes is one of those things like a rising tide lifts all boats that sometimes can end up doing more damage than good. So what does that mean? Growth mindset is that there's a focus on validating students' effort, their hardiness, their resilience, the effort that they're putting into the work. And in fact, Carol Dweck has said many times in her work, though her stance has changed partially as a result of the Black Minds Matter class that we had, has said that don't validate their ability, validate their effort. But when we're talking about students who may have never heard messages such as, you have the ability to do this, I believe you're intelligent, you're smart, you actually have to validate their abilities and their effort at the same time, because it assumes that there's a base condition that oftentimes is not in place for certain students from minoritized communities. And I'll give one for student services that also applies to faculty as well, and that's connect students to people, not services. Connect students to people, not services. Anybody seen, I've heard there's a movie out there called Green Book, where they're basically going through and trying to identify the safe places to be able to go for those who are from the African American community. Or many of us might think of the metaphor as of the Underground Railroad, right, where we're trying to create opportunities for our students to be connected to people who we know care about them and care about their success. So it doesn't work for us to say in the classroom or in student services, hey, this is what I want you to do. Go to tutoring because you're going to need some support, and just tell students to go to tutoring. Or tell them to go to financial aid because you find out they have a financial challenge, or tell them to go to career services, because guess what? For a lot of these students, particularly men in general, because of help-seeking socialization, and particularly for students of color because how they've been oftentimes framed as being academically inferior, they're worried about engaging in help-seeking. So every time that we tell them to go do that, they're oftentimes going to be apprehensive about doing that because that's a very uncomfortable situation for them to be in. And let's say that I've done all this work in building up a relationship with students. My students are really liking me. That student trusts me. I built a sense of rapport with them. I tell them to go to financial aid, and they have a bad experience there. Now, that's then going to reflect upon how they think about me, because I referred them to go there. So it's referring them to people who we know will trust, they can trust, and who will care about them in the same way that we do. So think about building an underground railroad, or those who you know will care about them in the same way that you do. It's important for building an environment of support for students who are disaffected, but it's also important for demonstrating our care and compassion. It's one thing to say go to those places. It's another thing to pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm sitting here, I'm meeting with Alicia, and this is what's going on with her. I'm sending her over there to your office right now. Will you be there to receive her? And I've then made a connection between a specific individual, and I've also made it so that she knows that they're waiting on her. So now that's not a new instance of help seeking, that's following through on directions. But even better, if I can just take a few moments and walk her over there and introduce her in person. The simple things that we do go a long, long way. And I guess the last one that I'll give that applies to everyone who works on a campus is be intentional about learning students' names. Learning a name is a valuable way of conveying presence and personhood, that we care about them. Now, there is a quote I oftentimes will show, and I'll try to paraphrase it in essence. It's from a faculty member who went to a college, and we were talking about the importance of learning a student's name. And one of the first things that someone said was, well, wait a second, I can't learn everyone's name. I mean, that's impossible. You realize I teach this many classes, I have this many students. And my response to them was to say, well, you know what? You may not be able to do all of it at once, but start out with those students who you know experience disproportionate impact. Like any other triage approach, and work out from there. Start out with those students who, based upon your experience in working with them, either in student services, as a classified staff member, or as a faculty member, start out with them first and then work your way out from there. And then someone pushed back and says, well, wait a second, I don't think you've been here. We have some students who have some really difficult names. And a faculty member beat me to a response. And this is what they said. You know, we ask students to learn all types of difficult information. We give them assignments that push them to learn within their zone of proximal development. We challenge them with concepts and theories and all these ideas. Any person, any faculty member, any staff member who says that it's too difficult to learn and take the time to learn a person's name does so from a standpoint of privilege that our students rarely have. So hopefully those are a few that might help. With that, we're going to go ahead and conclude. I'll be here for the rest of the day. Hopefully I'll have an opportunity to engage you. And one last quick thing, I have to do this, is when I first came and I had the opportunity to work at this institution, which was, again, one of the most formidable experiences in my career, and is really why I do the work that I do today, I had the absolute honor and pleasure of working with Tony Newman. So if you like what I had to say, then you can thank Tony. And if you didn't like what I had to say, then it's everything that's happened since then. All right, have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Listen, please help me in welcome and thanking Dr. Luke Wood one more time. So before I say any more, I should say too that I am here as a product of Tony Newman. So if you don't like me, blame Tony. Before I say any more, everybody stand up, stretch. We don't have any planned breaks in this because you know you will not come back. So just stand up and stretch for about 2 minutes and we'll get started.